Alicia thought she understood the silent contract of her marriage to Han Seok, the tatted heir to Seoul's most ruthless syndicate. 3 years of being a ghost wife. 3 years of separate wings in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. 3 years of being treated like a strategic asset, a merger of her elegance and his power that had already served its purpose. So she stopped waiting. But the moment Han Seok sees her under the predatory gaze of Choi Jin, the only man in Korea who doesn't fear the name Han, something violent and possessive, shatters his mask of icy indifference. He spent 3 years convincing himself that loving her was a lethal vulnerability. He spent 3 years keeping her in the shadows to keep her safe, only to realize he left her perfectly positioned for a rival to step into the light. The problem is, Alicia is done being a shadow, and Han Seok is about to learn that Korea's most dangerous man doesn't just want his territory, he wants his wife. The lounge was a symphony of dark velvet and expensive smoke. It was the kind of place where power was whispered and beauty was a currency. Alicia had chosen it for its visibility. No more hiding. "You possess a grace that this city doesn't deserve," Choi Jin said, his voice a low, textured rasp. He leaned back, the tribal ink on his neck peeking above his silk collar, his eyes sharp and aristocratic. He didn't look at her like a business partner. He looked at her like a man who had finally found the missing piece of his empire. "Thank you, Mr. Choi," Alicia replied, her posture perfect, her dark hair catching the amber light. "I was under the impression you only discussed business in private." "For you, Alicia, I would make everything public." He smiled, a dangerous, polished expression. For 3 years, Alicia had worn the Han family crest in silence. 3 years since she stood in a beaded gown beside Han Seok, who looked past her as if she were a piece of expensive marble. The marriage had been the ultimate trade, her family's refined global presence for the Han syndicate's ironclad protection. But protection felt a lot like neglect when your husband only spoke to you through his lawyers. She had stopped listening for his car in the driveway. She had stopped wondering if the tattoos on his hands would ever touch her with anything other than cold formality. "I heard the Han family is looking to expand into the port," Choi Jin continued, his gaze intense. "But I think they've overlooked their most valuable asset. If you were mine, Alicia, I would never let you sit at a table alone." Alicia opened her mouth to respond, but the air in the room suddenly turned heavy. The ambient chatter died. A presence materialized behind Choi Jin. Han Seok stood there, immaculate in a tailored black suit, his hair swept back with lethal precision. The ornamental tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse in the dim light. His eyes, intense, chiseled, and currently filled with a heat she hadn't seen in 3 years, were fixed on Choi Jin. "That's a very bold assessment of another man's property, Jin." Han Seok's voice was a pleasant blade, cutting through the silence. Choi Jin didn't flinch. He slowly turned, the 2 most handsome, dangerous men in the country now creating a terrifying visual symmetry. "Is the seat taken, Seok? Or have you finally realized what you've been leaving unattended?" Choi Jin asked. Han Seok didn't answer him. He looked directly at Alicia, his gaze traveling over her tan skin and elegant frame as if seeing her for the first time, or perhaps realizing he was about to lose her. "Having a drink with my wife," Han Seok said, his voice dropping an octave. He slid into the booth, his hand, ornately tattooed and possessive, resting on the table inches from hers. "Do we have a problem here?" Alicia felt the familiar tug of loyalty, but she didn't move. She looked at her husband, the man who had ignored her for 1,000 days, and then at the man who promised to give her the world. "You're late, Han Seok," she said coolly. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he replied, his eyes burning into hers. "And I'm not leaving without what's mine." The golden penthouse felt less like a home and more like a high-end gallery where Alicia was simply the most expensive exhibit. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her dressing room, the Seoul's skyline shimmering like a carpet of fallen stars, yet all she could feel was the suffocating silence of the last 3 years. Alicia reached for a bottle of perfume, the click of the glass against the marble vanity echoing too loudly in the hollow suite. As she spritzed the scent onto her tan skin, she caught her reflection. Her dark hair was a lustrous river flowing over her shoulders, and her posture remained as elegant and refined as the day she had walked down the aisle to join the Han dynasty. But beneath the poise, there was a weary clarity. For 36 months, she had been the ghost wife. Han Seok, with his model-esque features and skin decorated in lethal ornamental ink, had mastered the art of looking through her. He was a man of polished indifference, a mafia heir who treated their marriage like a document filed away in a dark cabinet. He provided her with everything: black cards, designer silk, and the protection of the most feared name in the country, everything except himself. She remembered the early days, how she had listened for the sound of his heavy tread in the hallway, or the way her heart would stutter when he'd return after midnight, smelling of rain and expensive tobacco. She had waited for the man behind the mask to emerge, for the husband to claim the wife. But Han Seok only moved through the penthouse like a beautiful, tatted specter, his intense eyes always fixed on a horizon that didn't include her. Tonight, the silence finally broke her. Alicia pulled on a dress that felt like a second skin, a deep emerald silk that complemented her complexion and spoke of a woman who refused to be invisible any longer. She didn't check the house schedule to see if Han Seok was dining out. She didn't care. She was done being a footnote in a corporate merger. As she stepped into the private elevator, her rings caught the light. The heavy diamond band was a weight she had carried out of duty, but tonight, it felt like a challenge. She wasn't just Han Seok's wife. She was a woman of color in a world of rigid tradition, a woman who had allowed her light to be dimmed by a man who feared his own shadow. She caught a glimpse of her security detail in the lobby, men loyal to the Han name, and she didn't offer them the usual polite nod. She walked past them with a refined, icy grace that rivaled her husband's. She was heading into the night, toward a lounge where the elite played and where she would finally be seen. The golden cage was open, and for the first time in 3 years, Alicia wasn't waiting for permission to fly. The lounge was a subterranean sanctuary of dark wood and amber lighting, designed for people who owned the city but preferred to remain unseen. As Alicia stepped through the heavy oak doors, the rhythmic hum of low-frequency jazz seemed to falter. She didn't just enter the room, she altered its atmosphere. The emerald silk of her dress clung to her curves like liquid envy, emphasizing the warmth of her tan skin and the effortless, lustrous flow of her dark hair. She moved with a refined presence that spoke of old money and new resolve, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic defiance against the polished floor. She took a seat at the obsidian bar, her movements deliberate and calm. She was aware of the eyes trailing her, the curious whispers of the socialites, and the sharp, calculating stares of the men who navigated Seoul's underbelly. For 3 years, she had been a rumor, a ghost mentioned in the footnotes of the Han family's success. Tonight, the ghost had flesh and blood, and she was breathtaking. At a corner booth, shrouded in the deepest shadows of the lounge, Choi-jin watched her. He sat with a stillness that was inherently predatory, a crystal glass of neat whiskey forgotten in his hand. While Han Seok's beauty was chiseled and cold, Choi-jin possessed an aristocratic sharpness that felt like a warning. The intricate, tribal tattoos climbing his neck shifted as he leaned forward, his textured black hair catching the dim light. He knew exactly who she was. In his world, information was the only currency that mattered more than blood, and the hidden Mrs. Han was a piece of intelligence he had studied from afar. But the photos had been flat, failing to capture the fire in her eyes or the way her sheer elegance seemed to demand the room's submission. He found it fascinating and insulting that a man like Han Seok could possess such a rare creature and leave her to wander into the lion's den alone. Choi-jin signaled the bartender with a subtle tilt of his chin. He didn't send a drink. He rose from his seat, his silk suit moving with a fluid, expensive grace. As he approached the bar, the air around Alicia seemed to crackle with a new kind of tension. "The rumors were quite modest, it seems," he said, his voice a low, textured rasp that cut through the music. Alicia turned, her expression unruffled, though she recognized the danger radiating from him. He was a mirror image of her husband's power, yet there was a terrifying warmth in his gaze that Han Seok lacked. "Mr. Choi," she replied, her voice smooth and level, "I wasn't aware you frequented such public places." "I don't," he admitted, his expressive eyes tracing the line of her jaw with an intensity that felt like a touch. "But I have a talent for spotting things that have been misplaced, and a woman like you, Alicia, you are far too valuable to be left in the dark." The atmosphere in the lounge, already thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the weight of Choi Jin's gaze, suddenly curdled. Alicia felt the shift before she heard it, a cold front moving through the room that made the jazz music seem to thin out and die. Choi Jin, however, didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in closer, his eyes locked onto Alicia's with a challenging spark. With a slow, aristocratic deliberation, he reached out and took her hand. His skin was warm, his thumb grazing the back of her knuckles just below her wedding band, before he pressed a lingering, respectful kiss to her hand. "A treasure left unguarded," Choi Jin murmured against her skin, "is merely an invitation." The heavy oak doors of the lounge didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. Han Seok stepped into the light, his presence a jagged blade of ice. He was immaculate, his dark hair perfectly swept back, the ornamental tattoos on his neck stark against the white of his collar. He didn't look like a man who had spent 3 years ignoring his wife. He looked like a god of war reclaiming a stolen shrine. His chiseled features were set in a mask of controlled fury, his intense eyes narrowing as they landed on the sight of Choi Jin's lips against Alicia's hand. The silence that followed was absolute. The patrons of the lounge instinctively shrank back into their booths, sensing the collision of two apex predators. Han Seok crossed the floor with the fluid, lethal grace of a man who had never known defeat. He didn't stop until he was standing directly beside Alicia, his hand, ornately tattooed and trembling with suppressed rage, landing firmly on her shoulder. The touch was heavy, possessive, and entirely unfamiliar. "I believe you're holding something that belongs to me, Jin," Han Seok said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that felt like a physical weight in the air. Choi Jin slowly released Alicia's hand, though he didn't move away. He stood his ground, the two men creating a striking, symmetrical image of tattooed power and high-fashion violence. "Belongs to you?" Jin echoed with a mocking tilt of his head. "Funny. I've spent the last 3 years watching the most beautiful woman in Seoul live like a widow. You didn't seem to want her when she was sitting in your house, Seok." Han Seok's fingers tightened on Alicia's shoulder, a silent apology and a claim all at once. "What happens behind my doors is my business. What happens in public is a declaration of war." "Then consider the declaration made," Choi Jin replied, his expressive eyes flashing with a predatory delight. Alicia looked between them, the husband who had broken his silence only when challenged, and the rival who had used her as a gambit. She stood up, shrugged off Han Seok's heavy hand, and stepped into the narrow space between them. "I am not a territory to be annexed," she said, her voice cool and sharp as a diamond. But as Han Seok's gaze finally locked onto hers, really locked onto hers for the first time in years, she saw the heat beneath the ice. The breach had been made, and the Cold War of their marriage was officially over. A much bloodier one was about to begin. The drive back to the penthouse was a suffocating vacuum of unsaid words. Alicia stared out at the passing neon blur of Seoul, her reflection in the window showing a woman who was no longer a ghost, while Han Seok sat beside her, his silhouette rigid and radiating a terrifying, pressurized heat. The moment the heavy doors of their home clicked shut, the silence shattered. "You had no right," Alicia snapped, her voice trembling with 3 years of suppressed isolation. She turned to face him in the expansive, marble foyer. "You don't get to play the protective husband now, not after 3 years of looking through me like I was a piece of glass." Han Seok tore off his suit jacket, tossing it onto a designer chair with a rare, violent lack of grace. He began to unbutton his cuffs, his movements jerky and frantic. "You went to a den of snakes, Alicia. Choi Jin isn't an architect or some bored socialite. He is a predator who smells blood, and you walked right into his teeth." "Because at least he looked at me." Alicia stepped into his space, her eyes blazing against his icy glare. "I have lived in this golden cage long enough to forget I was alive. You treated me like a business transaction, Han Seok. You ignored me until someone else wanted me. That isn't protection, it's pride." "You think I ignored you?" Han Seok's voice dropped to a guttural roar. He suddenly gripped the collar of his dress shirt and yanked it open, the buttons skittering across the floor like hail. He shoved the fabric down his arms, exposing the true extent of the ink beneath the high-fashion armor. The ornamental tattoos on his neck were merely the beginning. Intricate, dark masterpieces of dragons and shifting shadows coiled across his broad chest and down his ribs, mapping out a life of violence and heavy burdens. "I stayed away because every time I looked at you, I felt a target growing on your back," he hissed, stepping so close she could feel the frantic heat radiating from his skin. His intense eyes were fractured, the ice finally melting into a desperate fire. "In my world, what a man loves is what his enemies kill first. I thought if I treated you like furniture, if the world believed I didn't care, they would leave you alone. I made myself a stranger to keep you a civilian." He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering near her cheek, trembling with a vulnerability he had never allowed. "But seeing him touch you, seeing you smile at him, I realized that by trying to keep you safe, I've already lost you, and I would rather burn this whole city down than let that happen." Alicia looked at the ink, then into the raw, broken gaze of the man she had married. The polished air was gone. In his place stood a man who had been bleeding in silence for 3 years, hiding behind a suit that had become his own cage. The morning light filtered through the penthouse windows, cold and clinical, illuminating the wreckage of the previous night's confrontation. Han Seok had disappeared before dawn, leaving only the scent of his cologne and the memory of his raw, tattooed vulnerability. Alicia sat at the expansive marble kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea when a courier arrived. He didn't wear the Han family crest. He wore the sharp, minimalist black of the Choi Syndicate. He placed a heavy, matte black envelope on the table. Inside was not a romantic gesture, but something far more dangerous, a contract. Choi Jin's gambit was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He wasn't offering her jewels or empty promises of affection. He was offering her the one thing Han Seok had systematically denied her: agency. The proposal outlined a massive acquisition of independent shipping lanes in the Busan terminal, a sector currently under the Han family's shadow. Under these terms, the licenses would be registered solely in Alicia's name. It was a bridge to an empire of her own, a seat at the table that didn't require her to be a Mrs. or a shadow wife. Accompanying the documents was a handwritten note on heavy cream cardstock. "A woman of your intellect should not have to beg for a seat at her own table. You are a queen, Alicia. It is time you had a kingdom that Han Seok cannot touch. Consider this a gift from a man who sees the strategist, not just the trophy." Alicia felt a surge of intoxicating adrenaline. For 3 years, her identity had been tethered to Han Seok's silence, her professional worth used as a bargaining chip for his family's legitimacy. Choi Jin was offering to hand her the keys to her own cage. It was a blatant attempt to lure her away, a strategic strike against Han Seok's ego, but it was also a mirror reflecting the life she had once dreamed of before she became a footnote in a mafia merger. She traced the elegant, sweeping ink of Choi Jin's signature. He was playing a lethal game, using her as the ultimate weapon to dismantle Han Seok's control. If she signed, she would effectively be declaring independence from the Han Syndicate, sparking a war that would tear the underworld apart. She looked up as the elevator chimed, announcing Han Seok's return. He walked into the room, his suit once again immaculate, his expression a wall of polished stone. His eyes immediately fell on the black envelope and the sharp, aristocratic script of his rival. The air in the room didn't just chill. It turned to glass, fragile and ready to shatter. The question hung between them, unspoken and heavy. Would she stay a protected ghost in his shadow, or become a powerful enemy in Choi Jin's light? The gala dinner was an exercise in high-tension symmetry. Set in a private hall of obsidian glass and white orchids, the table was a battlefield disguised as a banquet. Alicia sat at the center, a vision of defiant elegance in charcoal silk, flanked by the 2 most dangerous men in the country. To her left, Han Seok sat with a rigid, model-like perfection, his dark hair swept back and his ornamental neck tattoos serving as a silent warning. To her right, Choi Jin leaned back with an aristocratic textured ease, his tribal ink peeking out from a collar that cost more than most men made in a year. The visual balance was haunting. Both men possessed the same sharp jawlines, the same polished, editorial grooming, and the same lethal void in their eyes. They were reflections of a single archetype, power personified, competing for the same sun. The Busan ports are a chaotic mess of old-world bureaucracy, Choi-jin began, his voice a smooth, textured rasp as he ignored Han Seok entirely to look at Alicia. He slid a vintage fountain pen across the linen toward her. My proposal removes the red tape. It gives you the infrastructure to build a legacy that doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. It's a clean break, Alicia. Freedom wrapped in a shipping manifest. Han Seok's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his tan skin. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a leather-bound ledger. He placed it on the table with a heavy thud that made the crystal wine glasses hum. Freedom is a fantasy in our world, Jin. You're offering her a target, not a kingdom, Han Seok said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He finally turned his intense gaze to Alicia, his eyes softer than they had been in years, yet burning with a desperate possessiveness. This ledger contains the voting rights to my father's secondary holdings. I've spent the last 48 hours forcing the board's hand. I don't want you to have a seat at a new table, Alicia. I want you to head mine, as my equal. As my partner. The air in the room felt like it was being sucked out by a vacuum. It was a literal bidding war for her loyalty, one man offering an exit, the other offering an empire. Choi-jin let out a soft, mocking laugh. A partner? You ignored her for 1,000 days, Seok. Now that I've shown interest, you're suddenly willing to share your crown? That isn't love. That's a cornered animal trying to keep its favorite toy. It's the truth, Han Seok hissed, leaning forward until he and Jin were separated by only inches of cold air. Alicia looked at the pen and the ledger, two identical versions of power, two tatted heirs offering her the world. She realized then that the symmetry wasn't just in their looks, but in their desire to define her. She looked at Han Seok, seeing the raw fear behind his icy mask, and then at Choi-jin, seeing the predatory hunger. The duel wasn't just between them. It was a test of whether she would finally choose for herself. The heavy, ornate doors of the penthouse didn't slam when Alicia left. They closed with a soft, final click that echoed louder than any shout. She didn't take much, only the things she had brought into the marriage herself and the emerald dress that had sparked the beginning of the end. By the time the sun began its slow descent over Seoul, she was checked into a corner suite at the Grand Hyatt, high above the reach of Han Seok's immediate shadow. For the first time in 3 years, the air she breathed didn't belong to the Han syndicate. It was thin, cold, and entirely hers. In the penthouse, the silence that Han Seok had once used as a weapon now turned against him. He stood in the center of the living room, his white shirt unbuttoned to reveal the dark, intricate dragons coiling across his chest. The space felt cavernous, a museum of expensive furniture that suddenly had no soul. His intelligence officers waited in the foyer, their heads bowed, expecting an order to retrieve her by force. In the past, he would have given it without a second thought. He was the heir, the model of calculated dominance. To let her walk away was a stain on his reputation. To let her stay in a hotel where Choi-jin could reach her was a tactical nightmare. But the pride that had been his armor for a decade was beginning to feel like a lead shroud. He looked at the empty space on the marble island where the black envelope had sat, and then at the ledger he had offered her, the desperate bit of a man who didn't know how to speak the language of the heart. He realized then that Alicia wasn't waiting for a bigger empire or a more polished contract. She was waiting for him to bleed. The night stretched on, a grueling test of wills. Han Seok paced the floor, his reflection in the glass a mirror of his own internal war. His father's voice rang in his head, preaching that a leader has no room for sentiment. But as he looked at the wedding band resting on the dresser, the one Alicia had left behind, the ice finally shattered. He didn't call his security team. He didn't send a lawyer. He grabbed his keys and moved toward the elevator alone, his ornamental neck tattoos hidden beneath the high collar of a trench coat. He was shedding the polished air and the Mafia prints, trading his reputation for a chance at redemption. He was heading to the hotel not as a boss reclaiming an asset, but as a man who had finally realized that his pride was a poor substitute for the woman who had lived in his shadows for far too long. He was going to find his wife, even if it meant admitting he was nothing without her. The hotel suite was a glass box suspended over the city, but the sense of freedom Alicia had felt earlier vanished the moment the heavy scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco filled the room. She didn't need to turn around to know that the lock had been bypassed. Choi Jin stood by the balcony door, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight, his textured hair slightly disheveled. The tribal tattoos on his neck looked like ink spilled in the dark. "The Hyatt is a neutral zone, Jin," Alicia said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her veins. "You shouldn't even be here." "I don't care for neutrality when it comes to things I want," Choi Jin replied, his aristocratic features softening into a predatory smile. He stepped into the light, his hands, decorated in ornate, dark patterns, reaching out toward her. "You've made your point, Alicia. You've humbled him. Now let me take you to a place where you'll never have to play these games again. My car is downstairs. Seoul will be yours by morning." He moved to take her arm, but the door to the suite didn't just open. It was kicked off its hinges. Han Seok charged into the room, his trench coat flying back to reveal his white shirt soaked with rain and sweat. He didn't look like a polished heir. He looked like a man possessed. Before Choi Jin could react, Han Seok's hand was around his rival's throat, pinning him against the glass window with a force that made the pain groan. "Get your hands off my wife," Han Seok hissed, his voice raw and guttural. Choi Jin laughed, even as his face darkened from the pressure. "Or what? You'll ignore her to death. You don't have the stomach for this, Seok. You're all silk and no steel." In one fluid, desperate motion, Han Seok let go of Jin's throat and reached into the small of his back, pulling a snub-nosed revolver. But he didn't point it at Choi Jin. He pressed the barrel into his own side and stepped between the rival and Alicia, shielding her with his entire body. His intense eyes, fractured and wet, locked onto Alicia's. "I spent 3 years being a coward," Han Seok whispered, his voice trembling. "I thought silence was safety. I thought if I didn't love you, I couldn't be hurt. But if you walk out that door with him, I have nothing left to protect anyway." He looked at Choi Jin, his jaw chiseled and set. "If you want her, you have to go through me. Not as a boss, not as a name. As a man who will die before he lets you take one more step toward her." The standoff was lethal. Choi Jin stared at the gun, then at the raw, tattooed desperation in Han Seok's eyes. For the first time, the symmetry between the two men broke. Han Seok had finally found something he was willing to lose everything for, while Choi Jin was only playing a game. Slowly, Choi Jin raised his hands, a smirk of begrudging respect touching his lips. I wondered when the dragon would finally wake up. He stepped back into the shadows of the balcony, leaving the husband and wife alone in the wreckage of the room. Han Seok dropped the gun, his knees hitting the carpet as he reached for Alicia's hand, his forehead resting against her waist in a silent, broken plea for the forgiveness he finally realized he had to earn. The transition from the wreckage of the Hyatt to the head of the boardroom table didn't happen overnight, but when it did, it was absolute. 6 months later, the doors to the Han Industries executive suite swung open, and for the first time in the syndicate's history, the air didn't chill, it electrified. Alicia walked in first. She was a vision of reclaimed sovereignty, dressed in a structured, sleeveless ivory suit that showcased the warmth of her skin and the elegant, unyielding line of her shoulders. She no longer wore the rings of a ghost wife out of habit. She wore them as the executive vice president of a newly unified empire. Beside her, half a step back in a gesture of public deference that stunned the gathered elders, walked Han Seok. The visual symmetry that had once been a source of conflict was now their greatest weapon. Han Seok had abandoned the high-collared shirts of his isolation. His silk vest was cut low, proudly displaying the ornamental ink that climbed his neck and the dark, intricate dragons that peeked from his chest. He looked like the model-esque predator the world feared, but his intense eyes remained fixed on Alicia with a heat that was no longer hidden. They were no longer two strangers sharing a penthouse. They were a united front of ink and iron. As they took their seats at the head of the long obsidian table, Alicia laid out the new terms of the Hang-Gordon alliance. She spoke with a refined presence that commanded the room, her voice cool and sharp, as she detailed the integration of the Busan shipping lanes, the very ones Choi Jin had tried to use to lure her away. She had taken his gambit and turned it into her own victory, securing independent power that Han Seok supported with a lethal, quiet pride. When a senior board member dared to question the shift in leadership, Han Seok didn't reach for a weapon. He simply leaned forward, the tattoos on his hands resting on the table as he caught the man's gaze. "My wife's word is the final word," he said, his voice a low, textured vibration that brooked no argument. "The era of shadows is over." That evening, as they stood on the balcony of their penthouse, the Seoul's skyline no longer looked like a golden cage. It looked like a kingdom. Han Seok stepped up behind Alicia, his tattooed arms wrapping around her waist, his forehead resting against the crook of her neck. There were no more separate wings, no more midnight arrivals in silence. "You're a long way from the girl who sat at the bar alone," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. Alicia leaned back into him, her hand covering his. "And you're a long way from the man who was too afraid to love me." The dynasty they were building was no longer just a business transaction or a mafia merger. It was a partnership forged in fire and ink, a new world where they stood together in the light, beautiful, dangerous, and finally, equal.